All right, what's going on, guys? For you guys that are new to the class, my name is Mr. Melendez. This is prereqs, right? A little bit about me. I got 17 years in the trade. Started off doing basic air conditioning. What you guys are going to learn here. I did that for actually, believe it or not, 2 months. After that, I moved up to commercial. Um, did that for about 10 years, commercial work, chillers, hydronic systems, boilers, touched a lot of stuff in the commercial world, controls, PLC systems, basic air conditioning package units, all that stuff that pertains to the commercial environment. After that, then I started doing ammonia, which is industrial refrigeration, which is kind of where you guys want to shoot for. That's the top elite refrigeration technicians there. Uh, After that, stopped doing that. Now I'm here. It's a little bit of background about me. Um, so what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to try and make this a quick little video. Um, is basically just touching up on the basic refrigeration circuit. All right. Now the basic refrigeration circuit, it's you have to get a good grasp of this. And I know not being in class, not understanding, what the book is trying to tell you, it's a little difficult. Believe me, I understand what you guys are going through and the frustration and all this, but hopefully all this stuff ends and we can continue back on track. So, um, I was gonna make a meeting or a webinar for you guys to join, but it's 10 o'clock in the morning and you guys are a PM class, so I figured I'd just do this and then upload it to the Google Classroom and see if this works out. Um, so basically what we're going to cover today is, like I said, basic refrigeration circuit. So hopefully you guys can see what I drew up on the board here. And this is your basic, stand out the way a little bit. This is your basic refrigeration circuit, right? Uh, Basic refrigeration circuit or air conditioning circuit will never change. Um, it would always consist of just your basic four components, right? So when we're talking about the refrigeration cycle or air conditioning cycle, it's never going to change. It's always going to be the exact same thing, right? There are a lot of exceptions to that, but the basic cycle will never change. You will always have these four components, no matter how low you are or how high you are in the trade. These four components will always be there. Um, so here we have our compressor unit, right? That's the heart of the system. That's where it's going to start. Um, so the compressor is basically the heart of the cycle. It's what pumps the refrigerant through the entire system. Um, After it leaves the compressor here, it goes into a line that's called our discharge line. Now the discharge line is going to consist of refrigerant, right? You're not going to have anything else other than refrigerant in any of this entire system. So when it leaves the compressor, you're actually going to have a high pressure, high temperature gas, right? Now a lot of people always think that refrigerant is always going to be a liquid. Well, yes and no. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But the compressor is going to take in this refrigerant, it's going to compress it. And when you compress any type of gas, you increase its pressure, obviously, and also the temperature will also increase, right? You guys have to understand that when the pressure increases, the temperature will also increase. When the temperature increases, the pressure will also increase, right? Those two guys go hand in hand. That won't change. So we discharge into our discharge line, right? That discharge line is connected to our condenser. And in a little bit, I'll show you guys the condenser and all the stuff. So we discharge into our discharge line, right? And that discharge line is actually connected to our condenser. The condenser is basically like a radiator in a car, right? You're shooting this hot gas into this condenser, right? And it's going to start to cool off, right? Once it starts to cool off, it's going to start to change its state. So it's going to go from a high pressure high temperature vapor down into a saturated point, right? So saturation is basically when you have gas and liquid living together, right? So you're going to have these two guys living together, and that's saturation. So as this makes its journey all the way down, you're going to start to have a lot more cooling effect going on. So it's going to start to reject a lot more heat, and that is the main job of this condensing unit, right? You're kind of in the way. Okay. I have another instructor here that's in flip-flops, and you'll see him in a little bit. I'm recording, not live, so.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know if the audio was going through. I had an issue with that earlier. Anywho's, so we'll go back to saturation, right? So we're saturated. The lower it starts to make it, or the further it makes its journey down, you'll start to get more liquid, more liquid, more liquid. The main job of this condensing unit is to reject heat, right? And we'll get where it gets its heat from here in a little bit. So it starts to reject the heat that it absorbed, and it starts to reject this guy out into the ambient air. Not too much. All right. So it rejects its heat out into the ambient. It comes down. By the time it gets down to the bottom, right, it should be 100% liquid. So here you guys can see that we got another line that comes off the bottom of the condensing unit, and this guy is actually called your liquid line. You know, common sense. You got 100% liquid, it's a liquid line, right? And right now it's just the basics, and we'll start to add a lot more components as we go along. But this guy here, this liquid line, is going to feed 100% liquid into this metering device, right? Now, metering device is just like the name implies. It's metering the amount of refrigerant, right? But this guy has a little bit more than just to meter the refrigerant, right? Not only is it going to meter the refrigerant, it's also going to create a change of pressure, right? So on this side here, you're going to have a high pressure system, right? Everything on this side, on the right side of this thing I drew, is all going to be high pressure. The minute this guy goes through here and comes out the other end, it's actually become a low pressure system, right? So everything on the left side is all going to be low pressure. So we're going to feed this high pressure liquid into this metering device. Once it comes out, it's going to become a low pressure, right? You guys have to understand at this young age in your tech years, right, that this guy is pretty important here, right? Not only does it meter your refrigerant, the amount of refrigerant you're gonna shove over here, but it's also going to create that low pressure for you, right? Now, just like I said at the beginning of the video, you know, pressure and temperature go hand in hand. So when this pressure drops, what's going to happen to your temperature, Moreno? Anyways, the temperature will also drop, right? So as your pressure's dropping, your temperature's also dropping. So on this side over here, you can have, you know, anywhere up to about 200 degrees, you know, and over here you can have a 20 degrees. It's the exact same refrigerant, right? The refrigerant hasn't changed, everything stays the same, but your pressure is what's causing the temperature to go from a high temperature to a low temperature.
Hence why we get the flash gas.
Yes, right. So down here we have flash gas, right? Because the pressure drop was so fast, so rapid, right? You are going to still have a little bit of liquid coming over here. Normally we call it about 70, 30, 80, 20, something like that. It'll vary, right? But flash gas here, we're going to have 70% liquid, right? And you'll have about 30% vapor, right? Hopefully you guys can make that out, right? So you guys have to understand that when this guy converts itself over into vapor, it can no longer do any more work for you. Once this guy has switched over to vapor, it's done absorbing heat. It's not going to absorb any more heat, and it's done. What's actually going to be doing any cooling effect is going to be our liquid. So this 70% of the liquid is going to be absorbing some of that heat for us, right? So as this refrigerant starts to make its journey up through this evaporator coil, it's going to start to absorb more heat. The minute it starts to absorb more heat, we're going to start to lose the 70% liquid. And actually this vapor is going to start to increase on us, right? So as this guy's making his journey through the evaporator coil, it's actually going to start to what we call boil, right? It's going to start to boil, become a vapor. So this liquid's going to start to boil off, right? Because it's absorbing that heat, and it's going to start to become a vapor. So once it gets to the top of the evaporator, hopefully, in a perfect world, we should have lost all that liquid. And this coil should be nice and cool, and this guy here is what's going to send that cool air into your guys' house and all that, right? So hopefully by the time we get to the top, we have vapor, 100% vapor. So when it goes to the top of the evaporator coil, we're going to have a line. It's a pretty fat line, right? Normally about, what, 3/4, 7/8, something like that?
Yes.
Right? So we call that guy our suction line, right? So the purpose of the suction line is just like I said, it's sucking from the coil, it's sucking from the low side, and it's actually going to feed our compressor, right? So again, we got our high side and we have our low side here. So this compressor, just like I told you guys earlier, it's discharging gas. So this is where we get our gas from. So after we boil all that liquid off, we should have nothing but gas here. This compressor sucks on that gas, compresses it, and takes that low pressure gas and makes it a high pressure gas. And then it begins to cycle over and over and over again. These four components here will never change. Just like I stated in the beginning, you can go and take these basic four components and you'll find them anywhere in a residential house, commercial building, or industrial. The four basic components will not change. Now, if we start to increase, this is just a basic. Here I'll show you a little kit that you guys will be building here at the shop that has all these four. As you start to increase this guy and make it a bigger unit, obviously, just like anything else, like automotive, when you increase an engine, you have to start to add more parts, right? Well, this is no different. If we increase this compressor, we make it bigger, we're going to have to get a bigger coil, a condensing coil. We're going to have to get a bigger evaporator coil. We're going to have to change this guy out. Well, now we're going to have a little bit more liquid now, right? Well, now we have to start to add stuff that's going to trap that liquid. Because if you send too much liquid on this guy here, you're actually going to have liquid that's going to start to make its way back into our compressor, right? You guys have to understand again, this compressor is nothing more than an air pump. All it does is suck in gas. That's all it wants is gas. The minute you put any liquid in here, you can actually damage the compressor, just like your cars. If you put a water hose in your intake and rev the engine and you open up that water hose, what's going to happen? It's going to suck in all that water and you're going to seize your engine. This guy's no different, right? You put any liquid into this guy, you're going to ruin that compressor. Kind of feel like a meteorologist right now. Because I'm looking at the phone and I'm pointing at stuff. I'm badass. Yeah. All right. Well, add anything to this?
Back to sports. Oh, no.
Back to sports with you, Johnny. All right. So if we're going to start to add a couple of things we can start to add here. Up here we can add a little canister, right? And that little canister will actually be called our oil receiver, right? So the purpose of this guy is just in case we have a little bit of a liquid coming in here. Liquid and refrigerant, they get along, but not that great, right? Now what I mean by that is that oil, think of it like 16-year-olds, right? That oil and the refrigerant, they want to mix and they want to bond and they want to get together, right? Well, what's going to happen is this compressor is going to be running a little bit warm, a little bit hot, right? So the refrigerant naturally is going to try to boil off if it's any liquid in there. When it boils off, it's going to try and take that little oil with it, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to start to foam, right? And you will actually, if you have a sight glass on here, you will actually see foam building inside. And that's just a refrigerant and the oil mixing together. So what's going to happen is that compressor doesn't care. It's going to compress it, and it's going to spit out that oil, right? So the refrigerant is going to carry that oil. If we don't have a receiver here, oil receiver here, or a catch can, if you want to call it that, then that oil will actually travel and migrate through the entire system. It tends to get stuck in the evaporator, well, a low cool spot. Normally a U-bend. This guy right here looks like a U. That will be your U-bend or your return. Forget what else to call it.
Some people call it a turnaround.
There you go, your turnaround.
But it's a U-bend.
It's a U-bend, all right? So if we don't have that guy in play, then that oil would just travel and make its way through the system and screw up everything. Then we have something that's called oil logging. So you can have your entire coil, evaporator coil here kind of frosted up, and you'll see a nice little spot where it's still thawed out. Or more than likely, you're going to have a little bit of oil just hanging out there. and that can actually hurt the efficiency of your unit.
Can cause a restriction inside your evaporator.
And then your pressures get all goofy, and you know, a new unit, right? It's required sometimes. And then down here, let me erase this guy for a little bit. We talk about our liquid line, right? So on that liquid line, if just like I said earlier, you have a little bit too much liquid going into the system. Well, we can install what's called a liquid receiver. Hopefully you can make that out. We'll install a liquid receiver. Well, just like the name implies, it's a receiver that catches liquid, right? So this guy can catch all the liquid that this guy's producing, store it here, and kind of feed it off a little bit, right? It'll maintain a constant flow of liquid to that metering device, which is what we want. Another thing that we'll add that's pretty standard with every unit, but some small units really don't have them, is going to be a filter dryer. I don't have one here.
You go right there behind you on the flare.
Right, and when I show you guys this little kit here, you guys will see it all together. All right, so this guy here, you guys can see that, that's called a filter dryer. Right, so the purpose of this guy is, again, just like the name implies, it filters any debris that gets in here, anything that's non-condensable. That's not condensable, I mean, it will trap it, right? This guy, I had a cutaway one, but I can't find it. It will trap all the debris, right? And it's also called a dryer. So in case there's any moisture, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, any moisture that comes in here, this guy will actually trap the debris and the moisture, right? It's like it's a little two-in-one, right? But if you guys look, if I can get it in there, all right, you'll see that it has an arrow, right? So that arrow there is telling you the direction of the refrigerant, right? So if you have it like this, and you got your liquid line here, and your metering device here, well, that's where the refrigerant is supposed to go, right? So it's going to work good. But if you install it the other way, well, the arrow's pointing this way, but your refrigerant's coming this way, you will actually create a restriction here. And then again, your entire system will not run good. You'll have a lot of issues. You won't be able to figure it out. Somebody will come along, see, hey, you got the filter on backwards, and there's your issue, right? So filter dry here. And they do get a lot bigger, but I'm going to keep it a little bit simpler. You also have, a lot bigger ones that have, the top where you can take off, and it gets a little bit better. Right, then our metering device. These are TXV on the table.
Want to use TXV?
Yeah. You'll hear that a lot. TXV. When you guys are talking about the cycle, don't call this guy a TXV, even though that's what's primarily used in the trade is a TXV. And TXV stands for thermatic expansion device or thermatic expansion valve. TXV or TXV. TEV. There you go. So don't get into that habit of calling that. It's a metering device, right? There's wide variety of metering devices. You can have hand valves. You can have modulating valves. You can have a TXV like we just talked about, electronic valves. There's a lot of valves out there that will meter, that will do the exact same job. So you don't want to come up to a seasoned technician and be like, oh yeah, the TXV is bad. Like, no, it's not a TXV, that's a modulating valve. Oh, you know what I mean. It makes you look a little bit, not so bright. So just get used to calling this guy a metering device. That's what it is, right? And he's over there looking for one, so we'll get one out here.
Found a balance board for the TXV.
Haven't talked this much in a while. So, talked about the compressor, the condenser, metering device, evaporator, the liquid line, the suction, the discharge line. So now what we're going to talk about, which is very near and dear to my heart, right? Something we call, and I'll make this go like this. Hopefully you guys can see that. It's called superheat, right?
Superheat!
Then we also have another one over here that's called subcooling, right? So superheat and subcooling, right? Those two things are very critical in our trade. They're you need them. They're a tool, right? And you'll see why here in a little bit.
I found one without the bulb on it.
That works. All right. So here, this guy here is a TXV, or what's left of it, right? But here you guys can see this guy here is your valve, right? So you got refrigerant that comes in. You guys can see that's a small hole there, right? So this is where your liquid line comes in, and if you turn it around, you can see how much bigger that exit port is, and that's going to be what goes into your evaporator. So here you can see you got a very small line that comes in, and then it gets bigger, right? That's where you're going to have that flash gas going on there. So you got high pressure coming in through a very small line. It opens up, drops the pressure very rapidly, and then you get your low side that goes into your coil, right? Now, if you look at the top here, it looks like a little UFO, right? That's where your diaphragm sits. Here's the body. So inside this diaphragm here, you can see it's connected to this line. Normally here you have a small little bulb, right? That's full of either refrigerant or whatever the manufacturer puts in here. And this guy actually sits on that suction line, right? And this guy's job, the bulb that sits on this end, its job is to monitor superheat, right? So as the superheat starts to increase, meaning our suction line temperature starts to increase, the liquid refrigerant that's sitting inside this bulb here would actually start to, just like it is over here, it will start to boil off because it's getting heat. It will start to boil. When it starts to boil, it's going to start to increase the pressure that's in here, right? So the pressure will actually start to shoot through this line here that goes through this guy here, and it goes to the top of my UFO, my diaphragm, right? As the pressure starts to increase, it's going to push down this diaphragm, which is going to push down the valve that's down here, and it's going to start to open up that valve, which is going to allow more liquid to come through, right? As more liquid starts to come through, that suction line temperature will actually start to drop a little bit, right? Well, this guy's going to sense this, and all that vapor you got in here now will actually start to condense into liquid. Well, the pressure is going to start to drop off, right? As the pressure starts to drop, this diaphragm will start to back off because there's also a spring in here. The spring's pushing that valve up, the diaphragm's pushing the valve down, right? So the spring will now start to overcome the pressure that this guy's exerting, so it's going to start to close that valve. Once you close the valve, you're going to reduce the amount of liquid that's actually going into this guy. And then what's going to happen? Well, this suction line temperature will actually start to go up now, right? Oh, it's getting a little too hot. Pressure's going to increase here. It's going to push on its diaphragm. It's going to start to open up that valve, and you're going to start to send more liquid. So this guy here will basically do this. If you have a trend of this guy, you'll see this guy just doing this. It's opening and closing, opening and closing.
Mind if I draw something on the
Yeah. Get my drink.
What do you use?
Purple.
So if we were to illustrate this valve, and we use this example that you have up here of a TXV, metering device, what you actually have is a cone here and then an opening. And this cone is going to move by the force being applied by the diaphragm. The diaphragm has a bellows that'll push down on this cone, working against a spring. Now, some springs have an adjustment screw on the outside where you could unscrew it and adjust the position of that valve. If we were to put the bulb on our suction line, we can see how the temperature is going to affect the temperature inside of the bulb, either expanding or contracting the liquid, applying or removing the amount of force on that spring. So this will show us the inlet and then the outlet. I think it's a little busy, but it works. Oh, you wanted... What did you want to do?
Got stuff.
Oh, you got filter dryers.
Here.
Ooh, you got a receiver too.
Talk about the little receiver.
Talk about the receiver. I actually want to go back to something. You were talking about the
Go for it.
oil over here on the compressor and oil migration. I don't think you really put too much into it.
Yeah.
So the compressor, once it's in a off position and it cools down too much, somewhere around 55 degrees, that refrigerant is going to want to mix with the oil and then condense inside of that oil crankcase. So what we do is we put in a heater to keep that oil warm, so when we go to startup, we don't have that mass expansion, we don't have that foaming. So once we get rid of that foaming, we're not going to have as much oil migration. What is oil migration? The oil starts to foam, and it gets taken out with the refrigerant as it's being compressed. And then it moves throughout your system, migrating throughout the system. So the way we catch oil is, we separate this pipe, we have an inlet, it'll shoot the oil down, and then we have sort of an outlet. So any oil will collect at the bottom. Cool, we collected the oil, now what do we do with it? How do we get it back into the compressor? Well, in the compressor, just like our system, we have a high side and we have a low side. So on the compressor low side, we're going to install a port and connect it to the bottom of our can. Now, how are we going to keep the high side pressure from entering the low side pressure of our compressor? Well, we're going to have a float, a little steel ball, if you will. So whenever the oil level rises, the ball is going to rise, and then the oil is going to exit the can and then back into the bottom of the compressor into the crankcase. So that's how we have the oil returning back to our compressor.
Correct.
So let's see, what do we got here? We have some sort of catching device.
Liquid receiver.
Receiver.
That's the one that comes out the little.
Ooh, almost dropped it. So going back to the receiver, we use it so we can store refrigerant inside of our unit. Now, why would we need to store refrigerant? Normally, we size these units for a specific load. This temperature range, yada, 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 yada. In refrigeration, which is a little different from air conditioning, just a little bit, sometimes we can overfill this unit for its worst case scenario. And then once your load gets down to temperature, we have an excess of liquid. What do we do with that liquid? We store it so we don't flood our compressor, damaging our compressor. So the reason why your compressor gets damaged whenever you get liquid inside of there is because liquid is not compressible or barely compressible. So eventually something's going to have to give. If you put too much force on something, you're going to end up snapping
Revalve.
Yeah, valves,
Pistons.
the parts of the side of your compressor, alright? You get it. I gotta go outside.
That hurt me. Flip-flop ass. Right. So, in here, I found another little filter. You can see this guy's a lot bigger, but the opening is still. Oh, there's a 3/8 line right there.
Okay.
Take that one.
I'll get mine.
Right. So, no smoking at the shop, guys. Right. So, we go back and talk about superheated subcooling. So, what is superheated subcooling? Well, superheat.
Oh, you know.
Told you I had more. Superheat, the definition of superheat, right? Textbook definition of superheat is where you take the refrigerant and push it above its boiling point, right? So I forgot to get my PT chart out. But let's just say a refrigerant, R22, which is getting extinct here in 10 years, right? We'll say, actually, you know what? I got a gauge right here. We'll say for R22 at 100 pounds, it's
84?
60. You off a little bit. All right, so at 100 pounds, what is it, 100 pounds, right? 100 pounds, it's saturation where you got liquid and refrigerant living together, half and half, 50-50, right? That's its saturation point, right? And we'll talk about these gauges here in a little while. So again, the definition of superheat is when you push a little bit more heat on that 60 degrees, right? So you might make it, 61 degrees, right? So you would actually have 1 degree of superheat, right? Which is you push that refrigerant above its boiling point by 1 degree, right? Now, when you guys look at these gauges, those numbers won't change, right? You have what's called a PT chart, which is a pressure temperature chart, right? Every refrigerant is going to have a temperature, right? That goes with that pressure. It won't change. You can look at any PT chart and it'll tell you, hey, At 100 pounds of pressure, you're going to have 60 degrees of refrigerant temperature. That's its saturation temperature, right? If you push it 1 degree above that, 60 degrees, you have 1 degree of subcooling. If you drop it down 1 degree from that 60, you'd be at 59 now, you're going to have 1 degree of subcooling, right? So that's the definition of superheat and subcooling, right? It's just push it above its saturation temperature, you're superheating. Drop it below its saturation temperature, you're subcooling, right? Now, superheat and subcooling are very critical to our trade, right? You guys have to understand that from the get-go, right? Over here on our high side, that's what we're going to measure and see subcooling, all right? So again, if you guys remember, we're dropping it a couple of degrees, or 1 degree, or 10 degrees, 15 degrees, whatever degrees below its saturation temperature. That will give us subcooling, right? So again, just like I said, and I'll draw something else here a little bit later on, or maybe in the next class. If you're dropping temperature, right, we're actually going to go from a saturation where you got 50-50, right? We're dropping it, so we're making it cooler, right? So as we're making this refrigerant cooler, we're going to get liquid, right? So remember that condensing unit that's sitting over here, the condenser, right? That's what its job is to give you liquid, right? So we want to have subcooling. We want to have some degree of subcooling. So what we're going to do, the way we measure subcooling, is we take our discharge pressure, or high side pressure, right? And we look at our PT chart, right? And it'll say, we'll use this high side here, we'll say at 200 degrees, or 200 pounds, I'm sorry, at 200 pounds, let me write this down before I forget. At 200 pounds, we're going to have 102 degrees saturation temperature for R22, right? So that means at 200 pounds, you're going to have a temperature of 102 degrees, right? That's coming out of your discharge. We're just giving you fictitious numbers here, right? So some of the stuff, if you come back in the future and see this video, be like, oh, Melissa's full of shit. Well, I'm just making numbers as I go here, right? But those two numbers there that I just gave you, the 200 pounds at 102 degrees is coming off that guy there. So that's real. So we got 200 pounds of discharge pressure, right? The first step is you take that discharge pressure, your high side pressure, and you convert it over to a temperature. So it's going to be 102 degrees.
Just check out this meme.
Oh, he's over here fucking looking at me, so I'm trying to teach you guys. Sorry about that. Anyways, so next step we're going to do is we're going to take our liquid line temperature, right? We're going to take our liquid line temperature, and we'll just say it's, for just the ease of this, we'll say it's 100 degrees, right? So I want you guys to understand this, and this will change a little bit as you start to progress in the trade, right? But for residential stuff, not so much. You guys got to remember that on this entire high side here, right, from the compressor discharge to the inlet of the metering device here, the pressure will remain the same. So if we have 200 pounds, right, it's going to be 200 pounds in the entire high side. So that tells you that, hey, if I'm at 200 pounds, I'm going to be 102 degrees saturation temperature, yes? So if anywhere you check here, it's going to be 200 pounds, 200 pounds, 200 pounds. So that means the saturation temperature will stay the same, right? But we get to the bottom here, and we look at this liquid line temperature here. That liquid line temperature is telling us that we're at 100 degrees, right? Well, how can that be? Well, just like I stated earlier, and so did Moreno, is this guy here is rejecting heat, right? So just like I told you guys earlier, the definition of subcooling is dropping it below its saturation temperature. So what we did was we dropped it 2 degrees below its saturation temperature. So what does that tell us? That tells us that we have 2 degrees of subcooling, okay? So the pressure is still the same. The pressure is still 200 pounds. But instead of being 102 degrees, it is now 100 degrees. So we lost 2 degrees. All right? So that means we rejected 2 degrees of heat, right? Which gives us liquid. And I don't want to throw a lot of stuff at you guys because you guys aren't in class and you guys can't raise your hand and ask anything. So if you guys have any questions, just write it in the comment box and I'll answer them. We have 2 types of heat, right? We have one that's called sensible heat, right? Again, like the name implies, we can sense it. We can actually put our hands on it, put a thermometer on it. It's sensible. We can sense it, right? The other type of heat that we have, it's called latent heat, right? Latent, which means hidden heat. We can't sense hidden heat, right? There's no way we can do it. We can't touch it or anything. We can't sense it, right? But that's kind of a truth and a lie all mixed together because we can sense it. Well, how do we sense it? We can't physically sense it, but the refrigerant has dropped down 2 degrees. You guys got to remember that this line here is made out of copper, right? Copper is a very good material that transfers heat and absorbs heat very fast. It's efficient at what it does, transferring heat.
I think you're looking for heat conductive.
There you go. That's what I was looking for. So, as that refrigerant here starts to lower its temperature, it's also going to lower the temperature of that copper pipe, right? So we can actually hook up a thermometer to that copper pipe, and we can see that we dropped those 2 degrees, right? So again, we take our discharge pressure, convert it to temperature, 102 degrees, and we take our liquid line temperature, 100 degrees. We subtract those 2 guys, gives us 2. So we have 2 degrees of subcooling, right? And then we come over to our low side here. Our low side is no different, right? We're going to take that suction pressure, which we're going to get off the suction line here, right? We're going to take the suction pressure and we'll go with, what's a good number? 60 pounds?
Like 65.
65 pounds.
34.
Ooh, 40.
Really? Man, I'm on my game today.
60 pounds, right?
34 should be about 57.
34 will be 50. What'd you say?
I said 57.
All right. So, as you guys stay in this trade and you're in here for years, you'll be nerds like us. We're like, hey, what's the temperature at this? Oh, I think it's this, and you'll be about anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees, within the ballpark. Some guys are even dead on. I used to be there. He used to be there, but we're out to trade.
22 baby is going away.
Yeah. She's a goner. All right. So we checked our suction pressure here, right? So our suction pressure here is 60 pounds. So what we're going with 60 pounds, 40 degrees. So we got a 40 degree refrigerant that's coming in here. Again, 40 degrees. It's saturated. Got both, right? So then we're going to check our suction line temperature. Our suction line temperature is going to tell us that it's at we'll go 45, right? Well, I said it was the same, right? Well, that means that we have picked up heat, right? So you guys got to remember that on the high side we're rejecting heat. What we want to get rid of that heat, right? Because we want to get liquid out this guy. But over here, on our low side, we want to absorb heat, right? Because we want to get this liquid refrigerant to boil off and to become a vapor. Yes? So, when we look at our suction pressure, right, converted temperature is 40 degrees. Cool beans, right? But when we check our suction line temperature, it tells us that we're at 45 degrees. So that means that we picked up 5 degrees, right? 5 degrees of superheat. Right, so normally you want to be above 10 degrees of superheat, right? That's kind of the rule of thumb. If whatever means you can't get, and don't quote me on this, I'll delete this video if you guys say I said it. Right, the rule of thumb is you want to have your refrigerant above 32 degrees. Right, now the reason for that is because what happens at 32 degrees? We freeze water. Right? So, and once you guys are in here, you guys will see everything, and we'll go a little bit more into detail. But this guy here, this evaporator coil, right? On the coil itself, it's cold. and you got warm air that's rushing up against it, right? So if you guys ever had a cold Pepsi or a cold beer, right, on a hot day, and you put that, where's my drink? No, mine's not doing it anymore. But if you put that cold drink on a hot day out, just sitting there, what happens? You start to get beads of water that runs on it. What do we call that? Condensation, right? So why do we get condensation? Well, that's because hot air actually holds a lot of moisture, all right? So you got this cold can that's sitting there. So as that warm air brushes up against that cold can, that hot air actually gives off its moisture to the cold can, right? So that's where you start to get those little beads, that water that run down. Well, the evaporator is no different. The evaporator is cold, right? So you got this warm air that's rushing up against it. So what's going to happen? That hot air is going to give off its moisture to that cold evaporator. Or you're going to have condensation. You're going to have water that runs down this evaporator now. Well, what happens is we have a refrigerant that's below or at 32 degrees. We're going to freeze that water that's on the evaporator. And that will actually cause an air restriction, right? Because we're building ice here. The air is not going to go through it. So we have an air restriction, right? Because that warm air that can't get through it isn't giving off its heat to that coil. Or what's going to happen? We're going to get liquid that actually starts to climb the evaporator and then takes off to the compressor, which causes damage. So airflow is a very big issue. It's actually about, 20-30% of a unit's efficiency. When a unit's running very poorly, it's normally going to be an airflow issue. Airflow can do a lot of damage. It can freeze your coil. It can send liquid back to your refrigerant. It can give you a high head pressure, which is basically saying that this guy's overrunning. Nothing's cooling it off. It can cause a lot of issues in their trade, right? So there we basically just touch on the basic, which is superheat, subcooling. Those two things are very important in our trade, and we'll start to talk a little bit more and more as we make more videos about this stuff. But I just kind of wanted to touch on all the basics of this stuff with you guys, right? Again, if you guys got any questions on this stuff, just shoot a comment in the video when I post it. Then again, we move on over to these guys right here. I'm pretty sure you guys have seen these guys here. These are pretty notorious for being on
commercials.
Any commercial, yeah. Anytime you Google HVAC or something like that, you'll see these guys here. Now these guys here are, believe it or not, I don't know if you know this, by 2022, they actually want to get rid of these guys.
Want to get rid of the hoses?
Yeah, they want to get rid of them.
Use pressure transducers?
All digital. Yeah. They want to go all digital, which for us old technicians, it's I don't like it. I'm old school. You guys will see that when you guys are in my class. I'm old school. I teach you guys all the old school stuff here.
I don't even like the low loss fittings.
Oh no, I hate them. So if you guys can see here, where's my camera? Right. So this guy here is going to be your high side gauge. Right. You can see it's reading at 0 now, and you can see my fingers are a little bit shiny. Right. And that's because a little bit of oil was in here. Last guy to use this gauge didn't bleed it out, so they're gonna catch a foot in their ass when they come back. Then here you can see you got the high side, but if you guys look right inside this blue hose right here, this guy here is still holding what is that, 125 pounds of pressure in here, right? So you guys can see, right, this guy is, I opened it up and I bled it out through there. But this guy here, what he was just talking about, this is called a low loss fitting, all right? I feel like a 50-year-old pedophile trying to get at a look. Hey, little boy.
Come here, take a look at this.
So here you guys can see this is called a low loss fitting, all right? I'll show you guys the inside here. So if you guys can see on the inside there, that guy, you want to give me a Schrader? This guy here is what hooks up to your unit, all right? So on the inside, this guy has a what's called a depressor, right? Behind the depressor, you have the actual spring, right? So as you hook this, and he's gonna bring one right now, but if you hook this guy up into your unit, right? This guy here will actually push down on a Schrader core, and you guys will see a Schrader core here in a little bit. And then that opens up the refrigerant line for you. And that will allow refrigerant to come through here, go through the hose, and then you will get a reading on the gauge we're going to talk about here in a little bit. You guys heard us talking. This is old school. We like the old school stuff. This is your standard refrigeration line, right? This is what we were using, way back when. And if you can see, I'll find where the camera's at. All right, this guy doesn't have a depressor, right? So you have a depressor there, and you don't have one there. All right, you see that? All right, so this guy here, the minute you disconnect this guy from your unit, right, it's going to cut the flow off immediately, and it's going to trap all the refrigerant inside this hose, and you're not going to have any refrigerant loss, right? Well, this guy here, on the other hand, right, the minute you start to back this guy off, you're going to start to shoot all the refrigerant out through this guy. This guy's not going to be able to cut it off. The unit's not going to bleed out anymore, but this guy's going to start to shoot everything that's inside this hose here.
So I brought you the whole assembly. That way you can show that.
So this guy here is just a little T-fitting, right? This guy will actually be hooked up to your liquid line, right? But here you got your brass cap, right? Always make sure you guys get brass caps. Inside the brass cap, you got you can see it hopefully. You got a rubber gasket or O-ring that sits out, and actually sits right here on this little bevel edge here, and actually makes a good seal. You'll see a lot of units that have plastic caps. I will recommend you guys change them out, even if you're in your personal unit, change them out, because plastic will just give off very easily and bleed out any refrigerant. There's a lot of oil in there. And you guys will be like, oh, I've seen that before. All right, so this little guy right here, you guys can see it. This thing will focus, just like they do in YouTube videos, eh? So this little guy right here, that's your Schrader core, right?
See the white backing.
Does that work?
Oh shit.
That work better. Oh yeah, look, we're fucking YouTubers here. All right, so that little guy right there, that's your Schrader core. So I'm pretty sure you guys are like, oh, I've seen that before. Well, yeah, if you ever looked at a tire, that's what actually sits in your guys' tires, right? But here, these guys have a different gasket. They work on a little bit higher pressure. That's these little guys right here, all right? So the way these guys work is right there, that little tip right there. If we push this guy down, let's see if I get this guy to work. You can see how that guy kind of lifts up right there, right? Well, that's tiny as this guy is, and compare it with a pin, right? That's a pin head, right? You can see that opening is as large as that point of that pin there, right? So that's where all your refrigerant's going through, right? It's crazy to think that little bit of an opening will give you a huge pressure, all right? But it does. That's what it does. And there, you guys can't really see it, is your openings at the top right there, and that's where your hose hooks up to that. So you took the damn hose, huh? So right here you got that depressor, right? So that guy here is going to go in here, right? That's the one with the depressor. So that guy's going to push down on it, if I can get it. Pushes down. Oh, my fingers are too fat. Pushes down on this and opens that guy up. Boop. Once it opens it up, refrigerant goes through here, goes in through your hose, and then you get your reading over there, right? So again, that's your actual valve body there. You can see there's nothing in there, right? And all you do is just put that little guy in there. You grab your tool, right? That little guy goes here, and we just make it snug. You guys don't want to Hercules this stuff because you'll damage it, right? And there you go. See, she's in there now. And then you would just get your hose, screw it on here, and the pressure will actually shoot out and do its thing, right? So And you just put your cap back on. She's good to go. Right? So, again, we'll go back to these guys here, right? So, you got your high side and you have your low side here. Now you can see that they're both at 0, right? These guys are very important for you guys to, hold on, I got somebody